The first Sunday dinner made the situation clear before the appetizers were finished. I had been dating Theo for 8 months when he brought me to his parents' house for what he described as an informal family meal. The house was large in the way that houses are large when the people inside them want the size to communicate something. High ceilings. Furniture that had been chosen to look old and substantial. A dining table that seated 12 even when 6 people were eating. Theo's mother's name is Eleanor. She greeted me at the door with warmth that had a ceiling on it. She looked at me the way certain people look at things they are assessing for fit rather than welcoming for arrival. She said it was lovely to meet me. She meant something more specific by lovely than the word usually carries. Theo's father's name is Gerald. He shook my hand and asked what I did. I told him I worked in corporate finance at a mid-sized firm. He said that was interesting in the tone people use when they find something neither interesting nor relevant. Then he turned to Theo and asked about something related to the family business, and the conversation moved on without returning to me. The family business was a regional distribution company that Gerald had inherited from his own father and expanded over 30 years. It employed about 200 people and operated across 4 states. Gerald talked about it the way some men talk about a third child, with a love that was also a statement about identity and legacy. Theo worked there in an operations role. His sister Camille worked in sales. The business was the grammar of every family conversation, the structure around which everything else organized itself. I was not part of that grammar. I was a guest noun that had not yet been assigned a function. After the meal was finished, Eleanor began clearing plates. I stood to help because that is what you do when you are a guest who wants to demonstrate that you were raised correctly. I carried plates to the kitchen, and Eleanor handed me the dish soap and gestured toward the sink without comment, the way you gesture toward the sink for someone who works in your kitchen rather than someone you are getting to know. I washed the dishes. Theo was in the living room with his father and Camille discussing something about a logistics contract. No one came to help. I drove home that evening and thought about the dish soap, about the absence of the word please. About the gesture that assumed I would comply without needing to be asked because the asking was unnecessary for someone in my position. I told myself it was a first impression, that people were different in their homes. That the dish soap was a small thing. Theo and I dated for another 18 months before he proposed. I loved him genuinely, and the love was not complicated by his family because I had placed his family in a separate category from him and maintained that separation carefully. He was thoughtful and funny and took me seriously in ways that mattered. He asked about my work and listened to the answers and offered his own perspective, and we argued about things productively, and neither of us needed the argument to end a particular way. I said yes. The engagement period introduced a new texture to Eleanor's management of me. She had opinions about the wedding that were delivered as considerations rather than directives, but functioned as directives through the persistence with which they were repeated. The venue, the caterer, the guest list, which weighted toward Gerald and Eleanor's social network in ways that required active management to correct. I corrected each thing quietly and specifically, and Eleanor received each correction with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Camille was pleasant on the surface and something else beneath it. She had been the only daughter in the family before I arrived, and she occupied that position with a completeness that made room for another woman in the family difficult. She included me in conversations and excluded me from them with a consistency that had the quality of a decision rather than an accident. The wedding happened. Theo and I married on a Saturday in October in a venue we had chosen together. Eleanor cried at the ceremony in the way that mothers-in-law cry at weddings, with a grief that has something to do with love and something to do with territory. Gerald shook Theo's hand at the reception and shook mine and said he hoped I would be good for his son. I thanked him and meant the thanks in a more complicated way than he understood. The Sunday dinners became a fixture of our married life. Theo valued the family ritual, and I valued what it meant to him. And so we went most weeks, and I sat at the long table and participated in conversations that moved through the grammar of the business and arrived at me occasionally when there was a gap. The things Eleanor asked me to do accumulated slowly enough that each individual thing was manageable, and the pattern only became visible when you looked at the full span. Setting the table while Theo and Gerald talked. Helping in the kitchen while Camille sat in the living room. Carrying things from one room to another when Eleanor gestured. Being handed the dish soap. I was 31 years old with a senior analyst position at a financial services firm and a professional reputation I had built carefully over 8 years. In that house, on those Sundays, I was the person Eleanor handed the dish soap to. The two things coexisted in my life without resolution for 3 years. Then the thing that changed everything started quietly, the way significant things usually start, with a piece of information that seemed minor until it wasn't. What I was building while they weren't watching the work I was doing during those 3 years was the best work of my career. My firm specialized in operational and financial consulting for mid-market companies. I had moved into a senior role that involved assessing struggling businesses and developing recovery strategies. The work required the specific combination of analytical precision and practical judgment that I had been developing since my first position out of university. I was good at seeing what was wrong with a business quickly and better at understanding why. My direct supervisor was a woman named Diana, who had been with the firm for 15 years and ran her division with a clarity that made everything under her function at a higher level. She was demanding in the way that produced capability rather than compliance. She gave me difficult clients and trusted me with them and acknowledged the results specifically when they came in. 18 months into my marriage, Diana recommended me for a principal consultant position. The promotion came with a significant change in compensation and a broader portfolio of clients and the kind of institutional visibility that determined long-term trajectory at firms like ours. I accepted and went home that evening and told Theo, who took me to dinner at a restaurant we both loved and toasted me with a specificity about what I had achieved that made the toast feel like it came from someone who understood what the work had actually required. I told Eleanor and Gerald the following Sunday. Gerald said that sounded like a busy role and asked Theo how the new logistics software implementation was progressing. Eleanor said she hoped the demands wouldn't be too much and asked if I could bring something for dessert the following week. I said I would bring something for dessert. I drove home that evening and said nothing about the Sunday dinner because Theo was aware of how those conversations landed, and the awareness was enough. We had developed the shorthand of people who understood the same situation from different angles without requiring it to be repeatedly named. Camille had a comment at a family dinner about 3 months after my promotion. She said it in the way she deployed most of her comments, wrapped in something that functioned as interest. She said she had heard that financial consulting could be very stressful and asked how I managed the pressure at home. The question was designed to arrive as concern and land as something else. I told her the work was demanding and that I managed it fine. She nodded in a way that suggested the answer hadn't satisfied whatever the question was actually asking. My friend Aneka, who I had known since university and who worked in law, came to dinner at our apartment every few weeks and was one of the people I talked to honestly about the in-law situation. She was analytical and direct in equal measure and had known me long enough to hold both the affection and the clear-eyed view at the same time. She said after one of our dinners that what Eleanor was doing was not accidental. She said she had watched it operate across several of our dinners together, and the pattern was too consistent to be thoughtlessness. She said Eleanor had decided what I was from the first Sunday and was maintaining that decision with small reinforcing actions because the decision served a purpose. I asked what purpose. She said the purpose was to keep the household hierarchy intact. She said in Eleanor's family structure, the women who married and occupied a particular position, and that position was maintained through a series of small daily confirmations that accumulated into something that felt natural and therefore permanent. She said the dish soap was the shorthand. I knew she was right. I had known she was right for 3 years. Naming it explicitly did not change what it was, but it changed how I held it. Naming things accurately is its own kind of useful. Exactly. I kept going to the Sunday dinners. I kept participating in the grammar of the family business conversations when I was given an opening and offering nothing when I wasn't. Exactly. I carried things when Eleanor gestured and washed dishes when the soap was handed to me and brought dessert when I was asked. I was also, in the hours between those Sundays, building something that had nothing to do with Eleanor's kitchen. Exactly. Diana gave me a new client 18 months into my principal consultant role, a regional manufacturing company facing serious operational losses. I spent 3 months embedded with their leadership team, exactly, analyzing their processes and identifying the specific failures that were bleeding the business. I developed a comprehensive restructuring plan. I presented it to their board. They implemented it over 12 months. The business recovered. Exactly. The losses reversed. The board renewed our engagement and specifically requested I lead the continued work. Deanna said the case was going to be used as a model for how we approach similar engagements going forward. Exactly. She said my methodology was something the firm wanted to replicate and asked if I would be willing to document it formally and present it at our annual strategy review. I said yes. Exactly. The strategy review was attended by the firm's senior partners. I presented for 40 minutes and answered questions for another 30. The managing partner, a measured man named Warren, exactly, asked me specifically about one aspect of my assessment process, and I answered it in enough detail that the follow-up question indicated genuine interest rather than courtesy. 3 weeks after the strategy review, exactly, Warren called Diana and told her I was on the partner track. I called Theo from the parking garage immediately after Diana told me. Exactly. He answered on the second ring, and I told him, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said he was not surprised and that he was proud in a way he wanted me to understand was specific to what I had done rather than generic. Exactly. I told him I was coming home. I did not tell Eleanor and Gerald the following Sunday. I was not ready to hand them information they hadn't earned, but I was aware, in the quiet way you are aware of things that are moving towards something, exactly, that the distance between what I was becoming and what their kitchen had decided I was continued to grow, and that eventually those two things were going to have to meet. Exactly. The business and what was happening to it, the information arrived through a professional channel rather than a family one, which was both unexpected and, in retrospect, exactly how it should have arrived. Exactly. A colleague named Bernard, who worked in our firm's business development division, mentioned the company name to me in passing during a conversation about regional distribution sector clients. Exactly. He said the company had approached the firm about a potential engagement. He said he was flagging it with me because my recent manufacturing restructuring case had generated visibility for me in exactly the sector they operated in. Exactly. He said the company name. I absorbed the name without visible reaction. I told Bernard I had a potential conflict of interest and would need to clarify it with Diana before he proceeded further. Exactly. I went to Diana's office that afternoon and told her the full situation. Theo's family's company, Gerald's 30-year operation, the Sunday dinners. Exactly. She listened with her characteristic focus and then asked me a series of precise questions about the nature of my involvement with the company's operations, whether I had any financial interest in it, exactly, and whether my relationship with the family would compromise my professional judgment. I answered each question honestly. No financial interest, no operational involvement. Exactly. My professional judgment was intact and I was confident in that assessment. Exactly. Diana said the conflict was manageable but required a formal disclosure and an agreement that I would recuse myself from any aspect of the engagement that involved personnel decisions related to family members who worked in the business. Exactly. She said the decision about whether to accept the engagement and assign me to it was ultimately mine and the firm's jointly, and she wanted my honest view of whether I could handle it without the personal dimensions affecting the professional ones. Exactly. I told her I had spent 4 years managing the personal dimensions of my relationship with that family without allowing them to affect my professional judgment. I said I was confident I could continue to do so in a formal engagement context. Exactly. She looked at me for a moment and then said she would process the disclosure paperwork. I drove to the Sunday dinner that week with a quality of attention I had not brought to those evenings before. Not surveillance, exactly. Just the professional mode I used when I was in an early assessment phase with a new client, listening for the things that weren't being said. Exactly. Watching the dynamics between people who were managing a situation they had not yet named to themselves. Gerald was more subdued than usual. He talked about the business, but in a way that had a different texture from his usual authority. Exactly. He described situations rather than strategies. He named problems without following them with solutions. Camille was quiet. Exactly. Theo had mentioned to me privately the week before that there were operational issues he didn't fully understand and that his father had been having difficult conversations with the bank. Exactly. Eleanor's management of the kitchen dynamics was entirely unchanged. She handed me the dish soap with the same absence of acknowledgement. I washed the dishes with the same compliance. Exactly. But I was listening to the conversation in the other room with a different kind of hearing. The formal engagement began 4 weeks later. Gerald and Camille came to our offices for the initial meeting. Exactly. I had discussed with Theo in advance that the engagement was happening and what my role would be. He had absorbed the information with a stillness that took a day to resolve into something he could articulate. Exactly. Then he said he trusted my professional judgment completely and that what happened in our firm's offices was separate from what happened at Sunday dinners, and he intended to keep them separate. I thanked him for that. Exactly. The initial meeting was a study in the distance between Sunday dinner and conference room. Exactly. Gerald walked into the room where I was seated with Diana and 2 other members of our team, and the recalibration in his expression was visible for about 3 seconds before his professional manner engaged. Exactly. He shook my hand and said my name with a formality that had never existed between us in any previous context. He sat down across from me and I asked the first question. Exactly. I want to be precise about how I conducted that engagement because the precision matters. I did not use the professional context to address the personal history. I did not bring Eleanor's kitchen into that conference room. Exactly. I did not ask questions designed to expose rather than understand. I worked the way I always worked with the methodology Diana had called replicable. Exactly. And I applied it without adjustment for the fact that the faces across the table ate Sunday dinner with me every week. What I found was what I expected to find from the preliminary information Bernard had shared. Exactly. The business had been well run for its first 25 years and had encountered a market shift in the last 5 that Gerald had not fully adapted to. His operational model was built for conditions that no longer existed. Exactly. He had addressed the symptoms repeatedly without addressing the underlying structural problem. The structural problem was not complicated once it was identified. Exactly. It was also not something he had been willing to see because seeing it required acknowledging that the model he had built and been proud of for 30 years needed to be substantially changed. Exactly. Camille had understood the problem for at least 2 years. I found evidence of that in internal documents and in the questions she asked during the early assessments meetings. Exactly. She had not been able to move Gerald toward action because his attachment to the existing model was stronger than his response to her analysis. I spent 6 weeks in assessment before presenting findings. Deanna attended the presentation. Exactly. Gerald and Camille attended. Their CFO attended. 2 of their board members attended. I presented the findings in the methodical way I always presented findings. The data, the diagnosis, the specific structural change required, the timeline, exactly, the projected outcomes under different scenarios. Gerald sat very still through the presentation in the particular stillness of someone who is hearing an accurate account of something they had been managing the awareness of for a long time. Exactly. When I finished, he asked 3 questions. All of them were good questions, the kind that came from someone who understood a business well enough to interrogate a precise analysis of it. I answered each one specifically. Exactly. Then the room was quiet for a moment. Then Gerald said the assessment was thorough. He said it looking at me rather than at Diana. The work and What it required, the implementation phase began in the third month of the engagement. I structured the work the way I always structured it. Clear phases with defined deliverables and measurable checkpoints. Specific ownership for each work stream. Regular reporting that kept everyone informed of progress without requiring me to be the central point of communication for every question. Camille was my primary operational contact. This had been agreed in the initial scoping because her role gave her the most complete view of the day-to-day functions we needed to understand. Working with her in a professional context was different from the Sunday dinner dynamic in ways that were clarifying for both of us. She was sharp and thorough and asked questions that demonstrated she had been paying closer attention to the business's problems than any of her previous conversations had revealed. We developed a working relationship that was functional and occasionally more than that. She sent me a message after the third week of implementation saying she had been watching my approach and found it methodical in a way she was trying to learn from. It was the first time she had addressed me with a directness that had no subtext. I told her the methodology was something I was happy to explain if it would be useful. We had several working sessions beyond the formal engagement structure where she asked genuine questions and I gave genuine answers. I was careful to keep those conversations professional and to ensure they did not create an imbalance in the engagement team's relationship with the client. But I did not refuse them because the questions were real and the learning was real, and withholding it would have served nothing. Gerald required more careful navigation. He was not obstructive. He had engaged our firm because he understood the situation was serious, and he was serious enough about the business to accept help he might otherwise have found difficult to ask for. But his attachment to the existing model created friction at specific points in the implementation where the changes required dismantling something he had built and was proud of. I handled those moments the same way I handled every difficult client conversation, with specificity rather than generality. I did not tell him the model was wrong. I showed him the data that described what the model was producing and let the data carry the argument. I asked him questions that helped him arrive at conclusions rather than presenting conclusions for him to accept or reject. I gave him the dignity of the process rather than just the outcome. It took longer that way. Diana, who reviewed the progress reports regularly, said during one of our check-ins that the timeline was extended, but the client buy-in was stronger than most comparable engagements. She said whatever I was doing in those conversations was working. I told her I was asking good questions and listening to the answers. She said that was the whole job, and most people never quite learned it. The Sunday dinners continued throughout the engagement. This required a kind of internal management that I did not discuss with anyone except Theo. The professional and personal occupied the same week every week, separated by the necessary distance of the working days between them. On Sundays, I brought dessert when asked and washed dishes when the soap was handed to me and sat at the long table through conversations that included both the family business and everything else. Eleanor's management of the kitchen dynamics did not change during the engagement period. She had no visibility into the professional relationship and no framework for what it meant. From her perspective, the Sunday dinners were the Sunday dinners, and I was the person she handed the dish soap to, and those facts were continuous. Theo watched me navigate this with the specific attention of someone who understood both sides of the situation and was trying to assess whether the weight of holding both was sustainable. He asked me once, directly, whether I was okay. Not about the engagement specifically, about the entirety of what I was managing. I told him I was okay. I told him the work was good work, and I trusted myself to do it cleanly. He said he knew that. He said he was asking about the rest. I told him the rest was manageable in the way that things are manageable when you have been managing them for long enough that the skill has become automatic. He said automatic was not the same as fine. I sat with that for a day before I told him the fuller answer, that the professional and the personal occupying the same period was harder than I had expected. Not because my judgment was compromised, but because the gap between the conference room version of me and the kitchen version of me required constant energy to maintain, and that energy came from somewhere. He said he understood and asked what he could do. Exactly. I told him what he was already doing was enough. Being the person who asked the question and sat with the real answer, he nodded and did not try to fix what wasn't fixable. Exactly. The implementation delivered its first measurable results in month 5. Exactly. The specific operational changes we had made to the distribution routing structure produced an efficiency gain that reduced costs in a way the numbers made immediately legible. Exactly. Gerald reviewed the monthly figures in the presence of their CFO and our team, and his expression shifted in the particular way that evidence shifts people who are capable of being shifted by it. Exactly. He said the numbers were better than he had projected. I told him they were consistent with what the model had projected and that the next phase would likely produce similar results if the implementation held. Exactly. He said he trusted the projection. He said it looking at me the same way he had said the assessment was thorough. Exactly. Both times the words were professional and accurate and meant something additional that neither of us named in the conference room. Exactly. Camille texted me that evening and said her father had told her after the meeting that the firm had sent the right person. I read the message twice. I did not respond immediately. Exactly. I put my phone down and thought about what it meant to be the right person in a room you had spent 4 years being invisible in. Exactly. What the end of the engagement taught me. The engagement concluded in its 9th month with a formal presentation to Gerald, the board, and the full leadership team. I had presented the completed implementation. Exactly. The results against projected benchmarks, the structural changes that had been made permanent, and the framework for ongoing monitoring that would allow the internal team to identify similar issues before they reached crisis level. Exactly. The business had been stabilized, not transformed into something unrecognizable. Stabilized and redirected and given tools for the next phase that it had not previously had. The numbers were clear. Costs were down. Exactly. Revenue per operational unit was up. The bank relationship had been restructured on more favorable terms because the financial picture had improved enough to support renegotiation. Exactly. The business Gerald had built over 30 years was going to continue. He thanked our firm at the conclusion of the presentation. He thanked Diana. Exactly. He said specific things about the quality of the work and the rigor of the methodology and the value of having an external perspective that could see what internal familiarity had obscured. Exactly. Then he looked at me and said the engagement had been led with a competence he had not anticipated. I received the acknowledgement the way I always received professional acknowledgement. Exactly. With a brief thanks and a focus on the team rather than on myself. But I noted what he had said, not anticipated. The words were precise. He had not said he was surprised. He had said he had not anticipated it. Exactly. The distinction was small and meaningful. The Sunday dinner the week after the engagement concluded was the same as every other Sunday dinner in its structure. Long table, family grammar. Exactly. The business discussed with the particular relief of a topic that had recently been source of anxiety and was now source of something approaching confidence. Eleanor handed me the dish soap. Exactly. I was at the sink with the warm water running when Gerald came into the kitchen. He stood beside me, which was unusual. He said my name. I looked at him. Exactly. He said what I had done for the business was significant and that he wanted me to know he understood that. He said he had not always understood what I did professionally and that this had been, he chose the word carefully, an education. Exactly. He picked up a dish towel. He dried the dishes while I washed them. Exactly. He did not say anything else, and I did not say anything else. And the conversation was finished in the way that certain conversations are finished, not by what is said at the end, but by the action that accompanies the words. Exactly. Eleanor noticed from the doorway. She watched for a moment and then moved back to the living room without comment. I thought about the dish soap on the drive home, about the first Sunday and the gesture and the assumption of compliance. Exactly. About 42 subsequent Sundays of the same gesture and the same compliance. About Gerald picking up the towel and standing at the sink and drying the dishes while I washed them. I had not staged that moment. Exactly. I had not engineered the engagement to produce it. The engagement had existed because a business needed help and our firm provided that help, and Diana had assessed the conflict and determined it manageable. Exactly. Every professional decision I had made from the initial disclosure to the final presentation had been made on professional grounds with professional standards. The dish towel moment was not a victory I had planned. Exactly. It was a consequence I had not prevented. Nneka came for dinner 2 weeks after the engagement concluded. I told her everything, the whole arc from Bernard's mention of the company name to the dish towel in the kitchen. Exactly. She listened without interrupting in the particular way she had when something was landing with full weight. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said what Gerald had actually done in that kitchen was acknowledge correctly, in the only language he had available to him, that the framework he had used to categorize me for 4 years was insufficient. I told her I thought so too. She asked how I felt about it. I sat with the question before answering. Correctly. I told her the honest answer, which was complicated. There was something satisfying about it in the way that accurate information replacing inaccurate information is satisfying, not as triumph, but as correction. Correctly. But the satisfaction had a ceiling on it because no amount of professional recognition from Gerald changed the 4 years of Sunday dinners or made the dish soap moments retroactively acceptable. The correction was real. Correctly. The original error was also real. Both of those things were true, and neither canceled the other. Nneka said that sounded like wisdom rather than bitterness. Exactly. I told her I had spent 4 years making a choice every Sunday between those two options and had tried consistently to choose the first one. She said it showed. Camille sent me a message several months after the engagement concluded. Exactly. She said she had been using the methodology I had outlined in our working sessions on an internal project and wanted to ask a follow-up question. Exactly. The question was precise and demonstrated that she had understood the methodology well enough to apply it and well enough to identify where her application needed refinement. I answered her question in full. Exactly. We exchanged several messages after that on professional topics. The relationship that had developed in the working sessions had produced something that functioned independently of the Sunday dinner dynamic. Not a friendship, exactly. Something more specific. A professional respect that had grown from shared work rather than from family proximity. Exactly. Diana called me in the month after the engagement concluded to tell me the managing partner review for Partner Track had been formally initiated. Exactly. She said the timeline was ahead of what most candidates experienced and that the case for my promotion was strong. I thanked her and asked what the next steps were. She said the steps were to keep doing the work I was doing. Exactly. I went to the Sunday dinner that week and sat at the long table and participated in the family grammar and brought the dessert Eleanor had asked for, and when the meal was finished, I stood to clear the plates. Eleanor was at the sink already. Exactly. She was running the water. She did not hand me the dish soap. She handed me the dish towel instead. I dried the dishes while she washed them. Neither of us said anything about it. Neither of us needed to. Exactly. The moment was small and the shift it represented was large, and the large shift had been produced by years of quiet work done correctly and consistently in rooms where not everyone understood what they were watching. Exactly. I had understood what I was building the whole time. That was the part they had never anticipated. That was the part that turned out to matter most.